Hello, my name is Evo Gomez. I'm a master's student at the University of Texas, El Paso, Texas. Today we're gonna talk about Sawtooth. Sawtooth is a platform, a blockchain platform, and this platform is useful to develop applications on top of that technology. We're also gonna see a hands-on tutorial on this platform Sawtooth, and this hand tutorial will be a tuna supply chain. So let's start. First, here is our agenda. We're going to talk about Hyperledger and how this new concept of Hyperledger interacts with our Sawtooth platform. Then we're going to go into more detail about what what the platform is about, what Sawtooth is, the benefits and disadvantages of this platform. And at the end, we're going to see our supply chain tutorial. So let's move on. Let's start with Hyperledger. What is Hyperledger? Hyperledger is an open source collaborative, and you can see Hyperledger as an incubator for blockchain projects. Sawtooth is one of the projects or one of the platforms of this Hyperledger incubator. Hyperledger is hosted by the Linux Foundation, and as I mentioned before, it's an open source. So, but what are the benefits of having a Sawtooth within this incubator of Hyperledger? Well, as you can imagine, this is an open source, so you have a lot of benefits for that community. This means that if you want to go and develop a platform, a blockchain platform, you can look into this Hyperledger and see what other people have already done on the concept that, or your idea that you have. I have some more benefits that you can read. So this is the full family of Hyperledger frameworks and tools. As you can see, Sawtooth is considered to be a framework of the Hyperledger incubator. We also have some tools and some other frameworks. All these frameworks and tools are based on the blockchain technology, and I want to focus on two. I want to focus on Hyperledger Fabric and Hyperledger Sawtooth. The first one, Hyperledger Fabric, something curious about it is that it was first developed by IBM, and then Sawtooth, which is the platform that we're using to develop as Ethereum. All these two platforms are based on the blockchain technology, and they have some attributes and different concepts and ways to handle information. So each platform fits better on different industries. Now moving to the industries, I want to talk about a little bit about what is the current work of Sawtooth. You can see four companies here. All these companies or products are developed on the Sawtooth platform, and if you notice, there is a diverse fields of industries. So we have the financial institute, we have the logistics. So Sawtooth is modular enough to comply or to fit on different industries. Okay, now let's jump into Sawtooth. First, I want to talk about the architecture of Sawtooth. I'm not gonna go into detail about each component, but I want to talk about the three main components, which is the REST API, the validator, and the processors. The REST API is our interface to the blockchain. It's how the clients or the users connect and send transactions to your blockchain platform. The validator can or has two functions. One is the middleman between the REST API and the processor, but it also handles all the functions related to the blockchain. What I mean by that is the validator is responsible to validate the blocks, to add new blocks into the chain. It also handles the transaction between the REST API and the processor. And one important concept here is the state. The state of the validator means the state of every transaction. So every transaction can have multiple states during its lifetime. One of these means that we have a transaction, we send it to the processor, but that transaction hasn't been validated yet. So the transaction is not on the blockchain. So you can see the state is like pending. Another important concept about the validator is the peer-to-peer network. That's how all the peers on the network connect to each other through the validator, and that's how the consensus algorithm is implemented. The last component is the processor. The processor can be seen as the business logic. It's the one that is going to validate the information that you have on the transaction. The validator doesn't care if you have strings, if you have numbers, it's just going to send the transaction to the processor. The processor is the one that is actually doing the validation of data. If you send a string and you were expecting a number, or if you send 100 and you were expecting a 1, so that's the work of the processor needs to do. It needs to validate the information within the transaction. Something important that I also want to point out is that Sawtooth has a kind of different format related to the chain. You can see the blockchain is a chain composed of multiple blocks, but on Sawtooth, those blocks are divided or structured in a quite different way. You have batches, you have the concept for batches. So each block can have one or multiple batch, and each batch can have multiple transactions. The transaction eventually forms a block, and then one or multiple blocks can form a chain. Now let's talk about a little bit about the transaction structure. As I mentioned, we have batches and we have transactions. Each batch has a header, and each transaction has a transaction header. You can see diverse attributes or fields to identify the data or the content of the transaction. Something important here is that each transaction and each batch is signed by the public key of the user who sent that transaction. Now, let's move on and talk about the last component of our Sawtooth family, which is the processor. The processor, as I mentioned, is the business logic. Sawtooth is really easy to use and to implement, and that's because you have multiple SDKs. What I mean that is that, for example, for Ethereum, we're using the SDK on Python to develop and code our processor and our business logic. On the processors, they have the concept of assets, and that's something I want to introduce to you. On this tutorial, an asset is going to be a tuna. What an asset is? An asset is a digital representation of a physical object. In this case, a tuna. Okay, well, we talk about a little bit about Sawtooth, about Hyperledger, about architecture, and about the components of Sawtooth. So let's try, and let's start with a tutorial. I don't want to jump around uh, displays and then go to the tutorial, go um, to the presentation. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna explain the tutorial to you, and then we are gonna start and then we're gonna explain the tutorial step by step on the Ubuntu machine or on the VMware machine. Okay, so what we're doing for tutorial, we're doing a tuna supply demo. This means that we have a tuna. That tuna will have an owner, and then the owner will send the tuna to a different owner. That's the whole purpose of this tutorial. So what we're gonna learn, or what we're gonna do, is we're gonna create two peers. We're gonna create a new asset, which in this case we're gonna call it Nemo. Then the owner or the holder of Emo will send it to a second peer or to a second holder. By doing that, we're gonna see, or we're gonna learn that on the blockchain, if you send something, it's gonna be on the blockchain forever. So, in order to send a transaction and that transaction to be valid, the second owner or all the owners need to agree to the transaction, or they need to accept the transfer. And that is gonna be our last step, accepting a transaction of Nemo. Okay, let's start. At this moment, you should have opened your VMware or virtual machine. Ubuntu should be running, and the login to access Ubuntu is Cascon2018. So you're gonna see a folder in your desktop called Education. Just navigate to the path, to this path right here, which is going to be Education, LFS, and then Sawtooth Material and Sawtooth Tuna. Right click on any point inside that folder and open a terminal. If you have, after you finish with step 1, you should have a terminal with inside that folder. So let's go ahead and run the docker command, and it's going to ask you for a password. The password is Cascon2018. So what that is running is going to take a few moments. What we're doing here is we're starting a Sawtooth instance. That instance is installing, well, it's not installing, it's setting up all the components of Sawtooth, all the components that we saw before, the validator, the processor, and all that. So all that command is doing that. After you finish, open a Firefox web browser and type localhost 8000 for 8000. You should see a web interface. The web interface is going to be a TunaChain interface. It's going to tell you, you should see a few fields, and it's going to look something like this, like the Sawtooth Tuna interface with some options. Okay, now that you have the web browser and the Tuna or the TunaChain web interface, go ahead and create a couple of users. For tutorial, we're gonna use just two, our first and second user. So go to the holder section, to the select holder drop down, and select create new pair. Just click and then do it again to create two pairs. That's all we need for now. Okay. On the next step, step 3, go ahead and open a second terminal. You can follow the same steps that we did on step 1. Navigate to folder, right click, and then open terminal here. On that new terminal, you're going to execute the docker command, the one you see here, and then you're gonna type the password Cascon2018. What we're doing here is we are opening a terminal to our container on Docker. If you remember, Sawtooth is running on this Docker container, and now we are kinda logging in into that instance, into that container. So let's keep that terminal on the side. We're gonna use it later. Okay, now let's create our first asset. Go to the section creating a record, type into the input Nemo, and then click the bottom create. I'm sorry. After you click create, you're gonna have the tuna list, or you will see a new asset which is Nemo, and then the holder. And if you notice here, the holder has these weird numbers. That's the public key of the holder. One of the attributes of blockchain is the anonymity of users. So there is no way to relate a Nemo to a real user outside the blockchain. But we know that holder 02 BFD is a real person and we can trust him. That's all we need to do. Or that's all we need to know, that we can trust the person, and that person is the only one that knows or can have this ID or can generate this ID. Okay, now let's go to our first terminal, and that terminal is like a log for all the transactions and all the operations that we're doing it on Sawtooth. The terminal has a lot of events, a lot of messages, but I want you to go and try to find the transaction that you can see on the upper of this image, on the image on the right. So try to go and look for the handle transaction and then create Nemo. Maybe you will see different numbers, but you should see the create Nemo as I have it on this image right here. So go ahead and look into that log, and you can also see the validator, the consensus, and all the different components that we have on Sawtooth. Okay, now let's go and let's transfer a Nemo to our second computer. What we're gonna do here is go to transfer tuna, select Nemo, and then select the second recipient or the second peer and click transfer. If you see the tuna list, the holder or Nemo is the same. So what happened there? We just click transfer. We sent Nemo to a second user. Why the tuna list is still showing the previous user or the general user? Well, that's because, as I mentioned before, the blockchain is an immutable ledger, immutable records. That means that both users must agree on the transaction. And how you can see that immutable transaction that I'm talking about? Go back to the second terminal that we opened, and we're gonna go and look into the blockchain, into the chain, into the information of our tuna chain example. So on the second terminal, run the commands Sawtooth block list and Sawtooth transaction list, and you will see something similar as our image below. What we're looking at is at the blockchain, at the chain, at the information that is stored in our computer. This is similar as running a query to a database, basically. And if you can see, there is a bonus command that I want you to do some research if you can. After you get the transaction list, you will see the transaction ID. So let's try and open a specific transaction using the transaction show command. I'm gonna give you a few minutes to try it, and then we can continue. Okay. What else can we see here? We can see that we are running on the Sawtooth. This is a command line interface, a default command line interface, and we're passing in the REST API, the IP of our REST API. So I want to continue to our last steps. Now go back to the Firefox and to the Tuna Chain web interface and select the second holder. Now, after you select the second holder or the second user, you will see a new option for us, that is accept or reject a tuna. So now, here is when the second pair is going to say, yes, I accept your transfer, and now Nemo is going to be mine. So to finish, select tuna, or I'm sorry, select accept, and then you will see the new holder on the tuna list. And if you want, you can go back to step 7 and review the new transaction and the new block that we have for that specific transaction, which was accept tuna. That's all that I have, or that's our hands-on tutorial. You can review more information about Happy Leisure, the Sawtooth platform, and the tutorial that we just saw on the following links. The Sawtooth information and documentation is pretty good. It has a lot of information, and if you want to investigate a bit more about the hands-on tutorial, I would recommend to go to the Hyperledger GitHub, to the repository. They have all the code there. As I mentioned, Sawtooth is an open source project, so you can go and look through the code and do some experiments on your own. So thank you. That's all for me, and now I'm gonna move into the actual hands-on tutorial, and I will explain step by step what we just saw on this presentation. Thank you.